Hello, friends. It's your neighborly English teacher, Ms. Ross. Um, the video I had planned for this week was to do a complete walkthrough of a prose piece. So I'll probably be splitting this up into two videos. In the first video, I'm going to walk through how I approach the prose prompt, any notes that I take, and my outline. And then in the second video, I will literally write the response in real time so that you can see how I'm approaching it in case that gives you some help. Anything that you could kind of consider when you're doing your own practice. The best way to prep for the test is to study terminology, which you can find on Quizlet, and to practice writing in real time. Because you know that you're only going to have 40 minutes to write this FRQ, and then you will have 5 minutes to submit your response. So you're going to want to practice this. Now, for you guys, I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to do it in real time because we've done a lot of FRQs. You will know what to do. But sometimes if it's a particularly difficult reading, it can be challenging to kind of get started, and you really want to be able to practice as much as possible. If you need prompts to practice, let me know and I can get you one. And please do not hesitate to send me FRQs that you need feedback on, and I will even tell you what I would score it normally. So I'm doing this in real time. I have not read this prompt before. I have not written about this prompt before. So I haven't even really done this with students before. So this will be new for me. So you can see me kind of struggle through and stop and start. And hopefully this is helpful for you. And this can be something you can reflect back on when you're trying to do your own practice and you're stuck as to what to do. Okay? So I'm going to start, just like I always do. Carefully read the following excerpt from William Dean Howell's novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham from 1885. Then, in a well-constructed essay, analyze how the author portrays the complex experience of two sisters, Penelope and Irene, within their family and society. You may wish to consider such literary elements as style, tone, and selection of detail. Okay, so I'm writing on my paper what it is that I have to focus on. It wants me to discuss the complex experience of two sisters. So I'm literally writing on my page this question: what is the complex experience of Penelope and Irene? Okay. We know this is going to get at plot and personality. All right. I know it's an excerpt. It's not the entire story. It's a piece from the novel. We don't know where, if it's from the introductory part of the novel, if it's from the central part of the novel, or it's from the conclusion. So that's information I don't have. But it also tells me I can focus on literary elements such as style, tone, selection of detail. Sometimes they put this here because it's very relevant. They pick devices that are going to be relevant to what you're reading. So I'm going to watch for those. And also it says, analyze how the author portrays the complex experience of two sisters, Penelope and Irene, within their family and society. So I need to make note of that. What is the complex of experience of Penelope and Irene within family and society? So by the time I finish, I should be able to articulate what that is. What is the answer to that question? Okay. So I'm going to read it once, and I'm not going to stop, and then I'll go back through and I will split up the text and think about this. Okay. Zoom in a little bit. They were not girls who embroidered or abandoned themselves to needlework. Irene spent her abundant leisure in shopping for herself and her mother, of whom both daughters made a kind of idol, buying her caps and laces out of their pin money, and getting her dresses far beyond her capacity to wear. Irene dressed herself very stylishly and spent hours on her toilet every day. Her sister had a simpler taste, and if she had done altogether as she liked, might even have slighted dress. They all three took long naps every day and sat hours together, minutely discussing what they saw out of the window In her self-guided search for self-improvement, the elder sister went to many church lectures on a vast variety of secular subjects, and usually came home with a comic account of them, and that made more matter of talk for the whole family. She could make fun of nearly everything. Irene complained that she scared away the young men who they got acquainted with at the dancing school sociables. They were perhaps not the wisest young men. The girl had learned to dance at Papanti's, but they had not belonged to the private classes. They did not even know of them, and a great gulf divided them from those who did. Their father did not like company, except such as came informally in their way, and their mother had remained too rustic to know how to attract it into the sophisticated city of fashion. None of them had grasped the idea of European travel, but they had gone about to mountain and seaside resorts. The mother and the two girls They had gone about to mountain and seaside resorts, the mother and the two girls, where they witnessed the spectacle with such resorts present throughout New England, of multitudes of girls, lovely, accomplished, exquisitely dressed, humbly glad of the presence of any sort of young man. But the Laphams had no skill of courage to make themselves noticed, far less courted by the solitary invalid or clergyman or artist. They lurked helplessly about in hotel parlors, looking on and not knowing about how to put themselves forward. Perhaps they did not care a great deal to do so. They had not a conceit of themselves, but a sort of content in their own ways that one may notice in certain families. The very strength of their mutual affection was a barrier to worldly knowledge. They dressed for one another, they equipped their house for their own satisfaction. They lived richly to themselves, not because they were selfish, but because they did not know how to do otherwise. The elder daughter did not care for society, apparently. The younger, who was but 3 years younger, was not yet quite old enough to be ambitious of it. With all her wondrous beauty, she had an innocence almost vegetable. When her beauty with its immaturity was crude and harsh, suddenly ripened, she bloomed and glowed with the unconsciousness of a flower. She not merely did not feel herself admired, but hardly knew herself discovered. If she dressed well, perhaps too well, it was because she had the instincts of dress. But till she met the young man who was so nice to her at Bay St. Joan, she had scarcely lived a detached individual life. So wholly had she depended on her mother and her sister for her opinions, almost her sensations. She took account of everything. She took account of everything he did and said, pondering it and trying to make out exactly what he meant. To the inflection of a syllable, the slightest movement or gesture in this way, she began for the first time to form ideas which she had not derived from her family, and they were none the less her own because they were often mistaken. Okay, we got at the bottom, or we have some citations here. We know Bay St. Joan is a Canadian resort. Perhaps we can assume they live in Canada. Papanti's is a fashionable social dance school in 19th century Boston. I want to find that part. Did they go to Papanti's? The girls had learned to dance at Papanti's, so they went to Papanti's, and yet there was some sort of special tier of that they weren't a part of. Toilet is dressing and grooming, not necessarily the toilet as we know it today. And then pin money used for small expenses and incidentals. So laces out of their pin money. Okay, so based on that question, right now, what is the complex experience of Penelope and Irene? We know that the two sisters and their mother very much did everything the same until one of the daughters didn't. So I'm just trying to figure out here which daughter it was. The elder daughter did not care for society. The younger, who was but 3 years younger, was not yet quite old enough to be ambitious of it. With all her wonderful beauty, she had an innocence almost vegetable. When her beauty was in its immaturity, was crude and harsh. Suddenly ripened, she bloomed and glowed with the unconsciousness of a flower. She not merely did not feel herself admired, but hardly knew herself discovered. If she dressed well, perhaps too well. Okay, so I am getting the younger, who was but 3 years younger, was not quite old enough to be ambitious of it. So let's see. What I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to make sure that I have a full understanding of who's being talked about, Irene or her sister. Because we know the two girls are named Penelope and Irene. Irene dressed herself very stylishly and spent hours on the toilet every day. Her sister had a simpler taste, and if she had done altogether, she liked, might have even slighted dress. They all three took long naps every day. In her self-guided search for self-improvement, the elder sister went to many church lectures. Right now, I'm assuming that we're talking about Irene, because it looks like Irene. No, it looks like Irene is the older. I'm just going to take a minute and try to make sure that I know. Okay, so we know it's Penelope that has the simpler taste. So it's Penelope had a simpler taste, and if she had done altogether as she liked, might even have slighted a dress. Okay, I'm pretty sure they're talking about Penelope. So I'm just going to go with that they're talking about Penelope. Now this can get tricky because if you are writing about someone who, if like you get names wrong or get confused here, oftentimes that can work against you in the passage. So that's why I was really trying to go through and make sure I knew who they were talking about. Based on how it's structured, it seems as though Irene is the older, and then Penelope is the younger. Okay, so let's go through. I'm going to stop actually on line. Let's just stop at line 20 here. So it sets up this family dynamic where the family is very close, and there's they each have kind of individual personalities, but they still do everything together. So Irene and Penelope are the sisters. We know that one of them seems to be a little bit more stylish than the other. It says they weren't girls who embroidered or abandoned themselves in needlework. Irene spent her abundant leisure in shopping for herself and her mother, of whom both daughters made a kind of idol, buying her caps and laces out of their pin money, getting her dresses far beyond her capacity to wear. So it seems as though they're almost not aware of their station necessarily, because when they say out of her capacity to wear, that could mean out of money, like it's money they shouldn't be spending, or it could be um, capacity to wear, like it's too stylish for her. Irene dressed herself very stylishly and spent hours on her toilet every day. Her sister had a simpler taste, this is Penelope, and if she had done altogether as she liked, might have even have slighted dress. They all three took long naps every day and sat hours together, minutely discussing what they saw out the window. In her self-guided search for self-improvement, the elder sister, so Irene, went to many church lectures on a vast variety of secular subjects, and usually came home with a comic account of them, and that made more matter of talk for the whole family. She could make fun of nearly everything. Irene complained that she scared away the young men when they got acquainted with at dancing school sociables. They were perhaps not the wisest young men. So at the end of line 21, there seems to be a sense that like Irene complained that she scared away the young men because she could make fun of nearly everything, I'm assuming. And then they were perhaps not the wisest young men. This is an interesting little bit because they put it's off to the side, it's on its own. And that indicates to me that that is the commentary either by the narrator or someone in the family was saying they were perhaps not the wisest young men. And they were not the wisest young men, therefore they were scared away by her. Okay, so that seems to be significant. Line 21 is one that I'll probably come back to. So if I'm looking at this first 21 lines, the passage sets up the family as being kind of very close, and yet the sisters themselves being quite different in temperament. The eldest is very stylish, while the younger sister seems to have a simpler taste. She's not nearly as flashy, or even as social. Then we'll go into this next section, and I'm going to end on, where should I end? I'm going to end at line 49 here. The girls had learned to dance at Papanti's, but they had not belonged to the private classes. They did not even know of them, and a great gulf divided them from those who did. Their father did not like company except such as came informally in their way, and their mother had remained too rustic to know how to attract in the sophisticated city fashion. None of them had grasped the idea of European travel, but they had gone about to mountains and seaside resorts, the mothers and the two girls, where they witnessed the spectacle which such resorts present through New England, of multitudes of girls, lovely, accomplished, exquisitely dressed, humbly glad of the presence of any sort of young man. But the Laphams had no skill or courage to make themselves noticed, far less courted by the solitary invalid or clergyman or artist. They lurked helplessly about in hotel parlors, looking on and not knowing how to put themselves forward. Perhaps they did not care a great deal to do so. They had not a conceit of themselves, but a sort of content in their own ways that one may notice in certain families. Their very strength of their mutual affection was a barrier to worldly knowledge. They dressed for one another. They equipped their house with their own satisfaction. They lived richly to themselves, not because they were selfish, but because they did not know how to do otherwise. All right, so some things that I find interesting here is the narrator seems to not know 100% about them, knows some things, like on line 21, they were perhaps not the wisest young men, but is almost like observing them, but does know some stuff. You get a sense that they go to places where people that are aware of their station in life and those in the upper crust go, but they don't know how. It says they don't know how to put themselves forward. The two girls maybe are much too close to their family, much too close to their mother to really be able to step out into society and get the things that they should. So when it says things like none of them had grasped the idea of European travel, but they would go to places like seaside resorts and see spectacle, but had no skill or courage to make themselves noticed because they were so involved in themselves, in their not as in a selfish way, but they did everything for each other as opposed to getting outside their comfort zones. It says their very strength of their mutual affection was a barrier to worldly knowledge because they couldn't find a way to get outside of that comfort and take a risk. Okay, and then it says the elder daughter did not care for society. Apparently, the younger, who was but 3 years younger, was not yet quite old enough to be ambitious of it. With all her wonderful beauty, she had an innocence almost vegetable. When her beauty, which is an immaturity, was crude and harsh, suddenly ripened, she bloomed and glowed with the unconsciousness of a flower. She not merely did not feel herself admired, but hardly knew herself discovered. If she dressed well, perhaps too well, it was because she had the instincts of dress. But till she met this young man who was so nice to her at Bay St. Joan, she had scarcely lived a detached individual life. So wholly had she depended on her mother and her sisters for her opinions, almost her sensations. She took account of everything he did and said, pondering it and trying to make out exactly what he meant to the inflection of a syllable, the slightest movement or gesture. In this way, she began for the first time to form ideas which she had not derived from her family, and they were none the less her own because they were often mistaken. All right. So what we see in this last section is the two sisters, as they're getting older here, start to separate. The elder sister, it says, does not care for society, but the younger sister seems to fall in love. She's very innocent and beautiful, but her beauty, it says, her beauty and immaturity was crude and harsh. And once it ripened, once she fully came into her beauty, she attracted the attention of somebody at school. I think it was school. Was that school? No, the resort at Bay St. Joan. And for the first time, she starts to formulate her own ideas outside of her family. Okay. So in terms of elements that I notice as I go through, if I look in that first section, there seems to be like, how do I describe it? I would describe the first section as there's a selection of detail that highlights the family unit. So the first part spends time talking about the girls and their family and how close they are, and then the second section of the prose piece here talks about the disconnect between the girls and society, or societal expectations. And I think you could highlight tone here. The tone here is observational. Um, almost there's almost a pitying here, and I noticed that when lines 24, where they say a great gulf divided them from those who did. So in a great gulf here, we've got that great gulf being kind of a metaphor for that kind of social divide. So I think that I would do well to talk about the metaphor of the great gulf, because that great gulf is keeping them from society, right? Um, and then description. Like if we see around line 33, multitudes of girls, lovely, accomplished, exquisitely dressed, humbly glad of the presence of any sort of young man. But the Laphams had no skill of courage to make themselves noticed. So it's description for contrast. It's contrasting. I guess you could say, if Emma Burkett's watching this, juxtaposition of the Laphams side by side, the elite of here in New England. Okay, so the first section I thought we could talk about selection of detail. The second section, I thought we could talk about contrast, metaphor, and the emerging tone. And then in the last section seems to be very much focused on growing up and the sisters dividing. And a lot of attention is given to Penelope here because she's falling in love. Now, we do see another metaphor of the flower, that she's blooming, and she's blooming in her beauty, but she's blooming in her individuality, or sense of individuality as well, and that she feels individual for the first time in her life. So metaphors of the flower here. The style of the writing in this is, I would say it's slightly detached. The the narrator does not seem to be deeply involved in their lives, but does seem to know bits and pieces about them, um, and doesn't seem to be critical of any one of them. It's, like I said, it's more observational, more detached. Um, Although there are lines like line 54 or 53 that talks about having innocence almost vegetable, and the way that I can assume that is her innocence almost like paralyzed her or made her completely unaware of the world around her. And it isn't until she finds love with a young man at Bay St. Joan. And it doesn't say that, she says that he was nice to her at Bay St. Joan. Um, Not necessarily that they're even in a relationship, but it is an experience with a man for the first time makes her start to question everything around her. So I would talk about how it's slightly detached, but also Um, I would say the selection of detail again, and trying to think here. Yeah, I think that's what I would want to talk about: the metaphor of the flower and the vegetable, obviously, and then the selection of detail in which how they describe how she moves from latching herself to the ideas of her family to latching herself to this young man's attitude and thinking about things that are different from her family for the first time. Okay. So if I'm outlining this, because I was pretty much just taking notes, the first thing I would do is I would identify something that is happening at the first third. So I noticed the first third talking about the family, setting up the family, and their desire to always kind of do things together, even if that kept them kind of isolated. The second part seems to be about their inability to kind of connect with society and societal expectations, and that they're a bit aloof about it. Like sometimes, like there seems to be a sense of pity, but also they don't really know what they're missing at the same time. And then in the last section, we see the sisters dividing for the first time, because the younger sister wants to pursue possibly love for the first time, and it causes her to act or to think in a way that she has not thought before. Okay, so for me, there's this kind of sense of natural progression from from growing up, and when you grow up, you start formulating your own thoughts. It can keep you kind of separate from other people. Okay. So if I go to the top and I want to answer that question, I want my thesis. It says, a well-constructed essay analyzes how the author portrays the complex experience of two sisters, Penelope and Irene, within the family and society. Okay, so I might say in William Dean Howells' novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, Howells, or I think it's Howells um, highlights the complex experience I'm going to say the complex experiences of the Lapham family, particularly that of the daughters, Penelope and Irene, attempting to illustrate the cavern that exists between the comforts of family and the temptation of individuality. So I'll read that. In William Dean Howells' novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, Howells highlights the complex experiences of the Lapham family, particularly that of the daughters, Penelope and Irene, attempting to illustrate the cavern that exists between the comforts of family, or maybe the comforts of their family, and the temptation of individuality. So that is my thesis statement that helps set up who I'm talking about and the fact that I'm going to be talking about the comparison of the comforts of family and the temptation of individuality. Notice I don't have like a roadmap of terms, right? I could, but I think that if my body paragraphs are well written, I don't need to do that. So it doesn't just become kind of like, here's my first element, here's my second. I want to be talking about multiple things as I'm writing, okay? So, given the notes that I have just taken, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to write the FRQ. And so I'm going to make a separate video just on writing the FRQ, and that way that this video doesn't become too long, and then you can sort of see me do it in real time and speed it up or slow it down based on what you need, okay?